Hey there, Marcy.
Hi, John.
Sorry, I was having trouble with my computer a little bit. Marcy, can you hear anything coming out of that room?
I can't.
Okay. I just want to make sure I wasn't the only one sitting in silence.
No, I wonder if they can hear us. You know what? Let me just ask Alicia. Oh, they can hear us.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is David Toland. I'm the Lieutenant Governor and Secretary of Commerce, and I'm very pleased to be chairing the SPARK Executive Committee, which is assembled here today for the first time. And I'm very grateful for the willingness of the members of this committee to serve on what is really a transformative opportunity for our state. It's an unusual situation to have the opportunity to invest the dollars that are coming through the American Rescue Plan and to make investments, one-time investments that can set our state up to benefit not only Kansans of today, but our children and our grandchildren. And so we're very pleased to be kicking this process off today, and we realize that we pulled this meeting together rather quickly, and we're grateful for your flexibility in making this possible. It's important that we get going, but we also want to make sure that we have a transparent process, that we have a thoughtful process, and one that allows all of us to go along at a pace that is worthy of the seriousness of what we're doing. So there's going to be a lot of information which is going to be shared today. We have a large slide deck, but I wanted to express that in the governor's emphasis on transparency, there is a lot of additional information which is available to members of the committee and to the public at covid.ks.gov. And so there's much more that you can dig into if you want to go further into the numbers, and we encourage you to do that. Our goal is to have a collaborative and transparent process here, and to take this money to make one-time investments, not to create ongoing burdens that the state can't sustain, but to make those one-time investments that will set us up for the future. We have been in contact with our local government partners through the Recovery Office, as well as agency partners that will be engaged in this work as we go forward, and you can expect that to continue and to be amplified as we go on down the line. So at this time, I would like to have each of the members of the SPARK Executive Committee introduce themselves. And President Masterson, would you please start?
Sure, I'd be glad to. Thank you for putting this all together, and look forward to having these conversations. My name is Ty Masterson, President of the Senate, former Chairman of Ways and Means as it comes to appropriations. So what else do you need to know?
That's great. Thank you. Mr. Pickert?
I'm Bill Pickert from Wichita, managing partner of BKD, CPA. I've been a lifelong resident of the state and been involved with a number of organizations here, statewide as well as locally. So glad to be here and appreciate the opportunity.
I'm Greg Orman from Fairway, Kansas. I basically spend my time now building businesses and raising kids. And other than that, happy to be here, happy to help think about how we use these dollars to help Kansas meet its needs in the future and ultimately create a place where my kids want to grow up.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker.
Ron Reichman, Speaker of the House. Glad to be here. Like the Senate President, I was also Chair of Appropriations, so it's kind of be good to be back in this role.
Thank you. Secretary.
Good afternoon. I'm Secretary D'Angela Burns-Wallace. I'm the Secretary of the Department of Administration. I'm also Chief Information Technology Officer for the Executive Branch.
Thank you. And we have John Rolfe, I believe, joining us virtually. John, are you on?
I'm here. I don't have enough internet bandwidth for you to see my pretty face, but I'm with you in voice and spirit and very grateful to be part of this. I'm on a family vacation in Colorado and should be with you at future meetings. So look forward to working for the best of Kansas together.
Terrific. Thank you, John. So at this time, I would like to recognize Secretary Burns-Wallace, who is going to take us through the slide deck and the mechanics of what we need to accomplish today. So, Secretary?
So I'm going to shift hats for just a minute. I'm going to stand here, and that way I can see everyone, so please bear with me. We have kind of two buckets we want to make sure that we're covering today. And I actually come in front of you today on behalf of the Governor's Office of Recovery, because most of this is more background information, things that have been covered over the last few months, and more administrative cleanup work. And as we go forward, the conversations, content, and other things that come back to this committee will be generated through Spark. And so you will see me sitting with you on the executive side, but from an administrative side, we were trying to make sure that we provided background as we walked through these materials. So next slide. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure, actually, if you can come forward for me. Probably two, one more. There you go. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure as we start this conversation and talk about and propose to the executive committee a few ways to think about how we move forward for this process. There's a lot that we learned last time. It was fast and furious, but there are pieces that we're hoping that we're trying to change and modify as this moves forward. But wanting to make sure that we started by just simply setting the stage and identifying the dollars that have come in across the relief acts along the way. And so what you see here is just an outlay of the various bills that have come out since last March, bringing us up to ARPA. It's important to note that all of the bills prior to ARPA really are focused or talk a lot more about emergency response. And you see the language in the ARPA bill begin to shift towards recovery and revitalization in the way that it is structured. When you look at the bills prior to ARPA, what I can say is that in those pockets, there is direct payments that have come into Kansas. There are increases in federally pre-existing funded programs that had came into Kansas. And then there's also been the discretionary dollars, which most people are most familiar with from just like the Spark process. But it's important to note that the dollars that have come in have been many different levels and in many different ways. So this is one snapshot of the dollars that have come in since the beginning of the pandemic from the relief bills themselves. The next slide shows the same set of monies, but with a different lens and showing how it's come in by sector. And again, in there you see there will be everything from direct payments to individuals as well as PPP payments to small businesses, but there's also the dollars that comes into agencies and the discretionary dollars. But this shows you just kind of a slightly different view of those same dollars, not necessarily by bills or how they were pushed out, as much as how they have hit various sectors over time. And you can see the call out for the discretionary dollars. That very first is the CRF. So that's what we know and think of as the original Spark process and the discretionary funds that were moved through last year. And then all of the 2021 funds are the ones that have come in under ARPA, some of which we will be talking about, but some have also gone to local entities as well. Move forward one more slide. So painting the picture of where we are right now from the state fiscal recovery funds, the discretionary dollars were given to the state. As a reminder, under ARPA, we're seeing about $8 billion that is coming into the state through various mechanisms. The biggest being that kind of top grayed out box of the over 3 million direct economic payments, as well as child tax credits. But in many other areas like childcare, education, health, housing and economic revitalization, there have been other dollars that have also flowed into the state, but these have come in tagged to a pre-existing federal program or a designated area for those dollars and aren't discretionary. So out of the dollars that have come into the state through ARPA, the box that is in blue, which is that state fiscal recovery fund, the one approximately 1.6 billion, those are the discretionary dollars. Those have quote unquote full discretion as long as you stay within the allowability guidelines. The others have come in and they come from the federal government tagged to a particular area: testing, vaccine, K-12, higher education. And so part of what as we start this conversation, wanting to make sure there's a backdrop of there are various dollars that are coming in that we want to make sure that we're understanding and also leveraging them together to maximize the federal dollars that are coming in. So if there are parts of the economy or sector that are getting certain federal dollars, making sure we understand what those are so that we're using the discretionary dollars to add to enhance, to move, to expand them differently, but using the dollars that are tagged a certain way that can only be used for that in that way. And so understanding kind of that holistic picture of what's come in, but particularly what's coming in under ARPA is something that we think is an important piece as we continue this conversation. All right, next slide for me. Just a couple of other kind of just more administrative points. This bill was set up in such a way that the states and the local governments who are receiving discretionary dollars receive it in 2 tranches. And so the first tranche has come into the state in May, and the second tranche, the way the bill is written, it says within a year of receiving the first, so we don't anticipate that the second will come in until next May. Around that, the dollars are there. It's not as if there's an issue or a concern about not receiving them. We bring this to the attention because it can be, depending on what we're doing and when we're doing it, a cash flow issue, however, of how many dollars have come in at one point and how many come in at a later. And there are other things, as you can see here, including a commitment to the UI Trust Fund that impact each of those tranches to be able to take those dollars at certain points. And so this is just more so for awareness that the dollars are allocated to Kansas. That's not as if the first tranche comes and we won't receive the second tranche. It's just more of a timing issue and understanding how the cash is flowing into the state. The local governments who have also received discretionary dollars also receive theirs in split tranches as well, just for kind of background. The other piece, which is different if we think about where we were in the Spark conversations a year ago and really dealing with an emergency, was that those dollars came in and the initial clock was that we had until December 30, 2020 to spend those dollars. And so it was almost a race to the end to ensure that we were maximizing the dollars. In this instance, again, with more of a focus on recovery and revitalization in ARPA, the clock to obligate the dollars goes through December 2024, and to expend the dollars goes through December 2026, truly allowing for that strategic opportunity for investment and maximizing the dollars. Thank you. Okay. One of the things that, based on the work with the CRF dollars and Spark before, we really landed in a place of wanting to make sure as we go into this conversation that we're thinking about a couple of things. And later you'll see even more lessons learned that we hope that we're trying to adapt into this new process. But here is a starting point, because allowability for ARPA funds is key and critical. And the next slide will actually walk through the federal allowability. I have to tell you that the initial interim rule document that gives all of the guidance of how you actually can spend it and what's allowable was 150 pages. And many of our offices have poured over it, and it was issued around May 10th, and we are receiving guidance almost weekly. We received another set of guidance yesterday. And remember, it says interim final rule. So technically the final rule is not final yet. And that means that large buckets of allowability probably won't change, but there will definitely be some nuances. And we also learned that last time. And so we start at a place, however, of using the knowledge we do know to ensure that as we start to talk about areas of priority and initiatives and programs, that we are paying attention to allowability. Also, this is one of those areas, particularly because we're at a different situation than a year ago, with funds coming into the state that are discretionary, with funds coming into local governments that are discretionary, with funds coming into other priority areas like education and health, making sure that we also are understanding that funding landscape, so that we, as we start to look at priorities and initiatives, where are the various sources of funding that can help us reach a goal that we are after, and that all of that may or may not need to come from the state's discretionary dollars, but can be a combination of both, and partnerships, things of that nature, thinking creatively of how we get there. And then lastly, as always, thinking about the impact of Kansans when we think about these dollars and what is changing in their worlds as these dollars are investment. So I want to walk through the guidance, and this is very high level. Again, this is kind of a distilling of 150 pages in a digestible bite. You can imagine there's many layers under here, but as you see laid out, there's kind of two types of allowability. And that first one, some of it is very similar to what we saw under CRF. Oh, can we advance? Nope, you're okay, thank you. It's over my shoulder, so I have to remember to go back one for me. There you go. Some of them are similar to CRF, like responding to public health emergencies, as you can imagine. But there is a little bit more that is allowable this time, including negative economic impacts. Also, there's a call out for providing premium pay to essential workers. It has a lot of kind of caveats to it, but it is specifically called out, as well as cuts in government services, or i.e. revenue loss. But guidance that we've received since the initial guidance is very clear that it must be forward-looking and not backwards-looking in terms of that loss, and as well as investments in water, sewer, and broadband. Additionally, there is this category that focuses on disproportionately impacted communities through various ways, whether it's the qualified census tracts, which are HUD designations for areas that there is a poverty rate of 25% or more, or areas that are addressing health disparities, or where it can be overall determined that a particular community was disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So when you start to look at these, it gives us some things that are a little bit broader than last time. Under CRF, and as we were moving through the Spark process, there was a much more of a heavier lean that it had to be directly related to the public health emergency, and it had to have a direct tie. This one is allowing us to open those parameters a little bit broader around just negative economic impacts, communities that were disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. Again, thinking about it more from the lens of a recovery and revitalization, helping everyone get back up and on their feet than just immediate emergency relief. There are a few places that are not allowable, as are outlined here: deposits into pensions, reduction in net tax revenue, payment of interest or principal on outstanding debt instruments, and contributions to rainy day funds. And again, these are distilled, but there's kind of layers of aspects that they kind of qualify why and how and what that might look like. And so with every piece of this, and when we look at allowability, it's important that we are, we work with Treasury throughout the process, as we did last year. States and entities are always sending questions for clarification. Their FAQs are pushing out. So as we go through this process, the one thing we did learn last year, if there is a gray area, there's an opportunity to engage with Treasury around getting clarification if that is a priority. And a lot of times we're not the only state or entity asking that question, and that's how we help to get stronger or clearer guidance in some areas. All right. So, thank you. So 2020, when we engaged in the Spark process, there were 6 high need areas that we're focused on. And again, this really was emergency immediate relief. These are the areas, and difference again being now shifting to recovery and revitalization. In your packet, in the back of the appendix, there's actually where you could see a breakout by these areas of like the percentages of overall dollars that were spent into any one sector. Also, as Lieutenant Governor Toland mentioned, at the covid.ks.gov site, there's actually a section of it that's COVID data. We have a dashboard where you can actually see, based on the dollars that were allocated under Spark 2020, you can see it by county, and you can see it statewide for the different areas. So we tried really hard last time as we were tracking on the dollars to be able to real time, and real time has a slight delay. It's about 30 days of reporting. And so to be able to push that out to say where were the dollars going throughout the process. That was really important because of how short the process was and how the dollars were moving. But we did learn that that's something that we want to try to continue, but it might look a little different this time because dollars may not move out as fast as they did. But being able to show where the priorities are and where the dollars are moving throughout this process, we received really good feedback from communities and stakeholders wanting to know what was happening in their county, what was happening in their region. And so that is something that we hope to continue to do. So if you go to the next slide, there was a good amount of work accomplished, particularly during an unprecedented time. From identifying needs to being able to support the local counties with their local needs and pushing dollars out, from testing and relief to businesses, as well as broadband, and many, many more. The list of stories and impact that happened from those dollars moving to and through state. We have been collecting and working a lot of that data. But there were some things that were definitely a challenge. And as we try to kick off this process, our goal is to try to do them better, to try to address them. I will say, because of the nature of how fast this moves and the number of entities that are involved, sometimes we don't always get it completely right and do everything that we can or want to do. But what I will say is that in the lessons learned spaces, definitely wanting to expand the opportunities for stakeholder engagements around the priorities, making sure that we're looking at the voices that are around the table and creating spaces for them to be a part of the process even more. Also, leveraging strategic partnerships. We saw some very exciting things that happened in the first round. Counties got together in a region region and leverage their dollars into new opportunities and, impacting their region. And and as well as when we look at some of the work that was done in broadband with some public and private partnerships. So there's major opportunity here to truly capitalize on more of those strategic partnerships, public and private, but also between the state and the local entities. If you remember, or just for those to kind of set that frame, the last time the discretionary dollars only came to the state, and we decided in the first round of Spark to take 400,000 and million, sorry, missing a comma, 400, I was like, I'm looking at the numbers in my head, 400 million, and we redistributed those directly to the counties. This time, the counties, all 105 counties, as well as 10 municipal cities, receive their dollars directly from Treasury. So it's a little bit different and gives us a different opportunity to leverage into kind of the state and local partnerships with our 2 buckets of discretionary dollars, because last time it really was just 1 bucket. And so it gives us a little bit more flexibility. And their allowances are slightly different than the state allowances, as you can imagine. Other things that we learned learned around innovative strategies and really encouraging those. And this time we have more time to be innovative and strategic. Last time it was sometimes out of necessity to figure out how to deal in the middle of a pandemic with things that we hadn't encountered before, but the state is better for it. But also, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of having a clear understanding of the state's needs and a holistic view of the funding sources and where their dollars are going, so that we can maintain flexibility and leverage in to the investment strategies in the areas that kind of lead themselves to priorities, but also being flexible enough for whether it's new emerging needs because of things that we didn't anticipate or that are changing, but also because of the changing federal landscape. In your appendix, there's an outline of the American Jobs Act and the American Family Act, which are both still pending at the federal level, moving at different speeds at the federal level. It's a very high-level sketch, but if either of those bills move through in the next 6 months or a year, that can have impact on these dollars because most of those dollars are going to be very targeted into specific areas that's outlined in there. And so it may be an area that's a priority for us that initially we say we want to use some of our discretionary dollars to leverage into. If one of those bills pass and have dollars that will touch that area, it would give us an opportunity to be able to move some of that around and leverage those dollars differently. So these are the things that we learned. Next slide, please. So the next few slides are proposed. And I say that to this executive committee just that way, because the nature of this, how big and complex it is, we wanted to bring to this committee a proposed structure outlining potential principles, priorities, structure, and timeline to start this work. And so as I walk through the next set, I will stop and as I have talked through the first few, trying to do background, but to stop to see if there's thoughts or questions or things that we need to explore further as we start to think about this. And so on each of the slides going forward, it does say proposed because there's nothing set in stone until this executive committee helps to move it forward. But based on the work that was done, the lessons that we learned, these are some of the things that we're bringing forward for consideration as to how we move this process forward. Timely, but still having a strategic focus, long-term focus. So we'll start with the guiding priorities, principles. And so, again, hearing from
Wallace?
Yes.
Before we go on, so are there mechanical questions that any members of the committee have about the portion that we just covered? There's a lot of information here, and we want to make sure that we
Thank you.
respond to those time. Yeah. Mr. Orman?
Just a couple of questions. First, you mentioned that the county's allowances are slightly different from the state's. Any material headlines there in terms of how the counties are different?
No, there is some slight nuances in what they can use it for, like what's allowable in their spaces, in relationship to, I believe, their revenue replacement, and then also in terms of the types of projects or the scope and scale of the projects. They are just slightly different enough that as we look at allowability, it won't be necessarily always one-to-one. And there could be an opportunity where local dollars would make that particular project allowable, but state dollars may not, or vice versa. And so I bring it up is that as we start down those roads and those partnership conversations, it's something we just will have to make sure that we're looking at. But they're not drastically different. There's just some nuances in some of the layers.
And then you mentioned that there are lots of stories coming in from the dollars that we previously invested. What are we doing in terms of data gathering to determine exactly whether or not those investments met their stated goals?
Yes. So a couple of different things so we've been collecting data throughout both quantitative, but also the qualitative data and the impacts in the various communities. We work both with kind of professional consultant partners that are looking to help us to measure impact, but also partnering with partners like our universities, where part of what we're trying to do now is to take the data from kind of this first round and set it up in such a way as we start to move forward where we have not a reporting dashboard, but more of an impacts dashboard. Are we seeing changes or differences in particular sectors, or, the goals were to ensure that this particular sector was surviving or thriving? How is that data comparing? And so there's a couple of faculty and research centers that we've been working with some of our state universities to be able to take more of the raw data that's being collected to now put it into more of an analysis, which ideally can also be helpful as we begin to move forward and start to look at now where are the gaps, or what might have been addressed and what might have been left. So we have a lot more raw data than analysis at this point, and that's what we're ready to move to.
Do you have timing on that?
Probably the next couple of months. Part of it was trying to get through and see what ARPA looked like to be able to stand it up. And then some of it will be driven by the priority areas of this group, if there are particular areas in that are of interest as well.
And then one final question, which is what kind of risk do you perceive to spending and committing dollars prior to a final rule being promulgated by Treasury?
I don't think that there's a major risk. There's what I will say is that this is going to take us a little bit of time, as you can imagine, to start kind of at high level buckets and then start to move through and to really sharpen and finalize what programs or initiatives that we're going to do. That the final rule feedback deadline is actually like in another week. So we anticipate that, it will come out this summer. But because we continue to get guidance, we're just used to it. It's one of those, typically the guidance, how do I explain, like sharpens the view on a piece of thing, not necessarily changes it completely. It makes it a little bit more clear as to how you leverage it. And so what I will tell you is that to stop the process, to wait till we believe we have quote unquote final guidance may never happen. It's just the nature of how federal programs roll out. What I will say is that this is much more comprehensive than where we started with under CRF. We didn't have as a comprehensive of a guidance package that we had walking into this one. So I think our confidence in it being very firm and there will be some nuances that will come out of it is in a good place. Does that answer your question? Wonderful.
The $1 billion for cities and counties, does that include the non-entitlement unit monies as well?
So it does include, in the $1 billion figure, it does include the non-entitlement units. They are, I want to say, 167 million is the dollar amount that went to the non-entitlement units, but that 167 million is in the 1 billion total. The difference with the non-entitlement units, and I talk about them a little bit later, is because they are smaller entities of government, what Treasury decided to do, they sent the 105 counties direct, they sent the 10 municipal cities direct, and the non-entitlement units, their dollars came to the state for us to administer. They're not part of the state's discretionary dollars, however. We are literally almost like a pass-through arm. We had to do a set of administrative calculations to determine their eligibility and their dollar amounts. And then we actually right now have our portal open, are in the process of getting all of the necessary, because then Treasury came out with about 6 things that we had to collect from them before we could release those dollars. And so we are really, for that group, more of an administrative arm. We don't even do their reporting and compliance. They still have to do that direct to Treasury. We're just moving the dollars. Does that help?
Just curious about your concept of leveraging the local money with the state money. Is that implying that you anticipate there would be some incentives provided to the local units to spend their money in a certain way by incentivizing them?
So I think that that's some of the work that this group can do, creating opportunities for matches or incentivizing into certain areas where it could make sense, where there's goals that will layer onto a particular county or a city. I think that the idea here is that as we start to think through not only that kind of high level buckets, but really start to think about where are those target areas for programs or initiatives, there's an opportunity in program design to think about how we can do that so that it's beneficial in both directions.
And Secretary Burns-Wallace, for folks who may not be familiar with all the terminology, can you explain in plain English what non-entitlement units are?
I can try as my team laughs behind me. Hold on one second, I have a slide. So the non-entitlement units, so the non-entitlement units by Treasury were deemed cities and townships with populations of 50,000 or less. And they use census data for this. And so when Treasury did their straight calculations using the census data, there were 614 Kansas units that were identified as incorporated places. And so those automatically showed up on a Treasury list. But we happen to also be a state that had a lot of entities that are called minor civil divisions, so much smaller entities that are not incorporated. We actually have over 1,800 of those, many of them being townships or other types of entities. And so we were one of 8 states that had that configuration within our state. And Treasury actually charged those 8 states that we had to apply a different criteria to determine eligibility of our minor civil divisions, and then determine, because the dollar amount going to non-entitlement entities didn't change no matter what. So the dollar amount was set. It was about which entities were eligible, and there were a couple of different things we had to look at. We had to do a facts and circumstances test to determine if they were legal and their legal and operational capacity, as well as the range of services that they provide that were actually allowable under ARPA. So many of these smaller entities, these minor civil divisions, only control roads, which weren't allowable under ARPA. But there is a small group of them that also have like EMS and fire. And so that's why later you'll see one of the recommendations we're asking for is there a way for us to set aside a set of dollars for some of those townships that are a little bit bigger and that actually have some allowable, because the way that Treasury provided for us to approach it, all of the minor civil divisions, those smaller units, were categorically excluded from our process. And I know that's like multiple layers deep, but I want you to know, like, that just shares like what this is. Like, every aspect of ARPA, every aspect of these dollars that are coming in has this layer of complication that also has federal descriptions that may or may not fit our state that we then have to interpret and then try to ensure that we are looking at, equitable distributions and things within the state. So.
Thank you very much. President Masterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You touched on a few of mine. One of them in that local distribution, the opportunities that there might be for cost sharing, if you will, like we do often in transportation, that allow us to leverage. Because it's clear with that amount of resourcing, there could be some overlaps from what we might want to look at this level. My other quick question on it are the dollars, the ARPA dollars that are in the shaded out areas, they're the 1.6, are those also expected in the 2 tranches that they'll get half of this has already been distributed here in this May, half a year later? Are they on a similar distribution schedule, or is that?
So if you're talking about those that are shaded out, like education and health, they are actually on all different schedules because many of them are related to pre-existing federal programs. So some of them are actually drawdowns. So they're not even they're not like the dollars coming in. So like in education, they have access to draw down a larger amount for ESSER, but they have to draw it down, right? And so there are timelines tied to that. Healthcare, same thing. There are multiple different programs that make that up. They all have different timelines and distributions. The housing and rental assistance, there were dollars that came in under the December relief bill, CAA. There's additional dollars that are coming under ARPA. You have to do certain things with the first ones before you can access the second ones. They'll give you a certain percentage early, you get and then that triggers something else. So that's the interesting thing about this is in all of those shaded areas, while Spark will be focusing on the discretionary, you'll see later as I talk about the Office of Recovery in general, that's part of what the Office of Recovery is doing is tracking on all the other pieces as well. So while it is supporting the Spark process, it's also working with state agencies and other entities, making sure that we can track on that. Last session, for those that you were in budget sessions, like we helped provide from CRF, all of the relief dollars that came in, not just the Spark ones, because as a state and under my hat as the Secretary of Administration, we are responsible for the state's comprehensive audit and all dollars that flow to and through. So we're tracking on these in different buckets in different ways as well. So it's the only other set of dollars that's in that shaded area that functions very similar to what Spark will be working with is the local relief dollars in the sense that they kind of follow. They were actually written together mostly in the way the bill was. Usually you see them side by side. All the rest of this, completely different timing.
So that touches on my final question, right? It's down to the decision makers. So are the education dollars, or is the decision maker the state board? Or is there anything running there? Or is this entirely executive branch decision-making outside of the locals once the money's dispersed? And I suppose more specifically, the recovery office and maybe even more specifically you. So if we have you on this committee, because that's where you'll run afoul, right? We make a decision, there's another set of decision makers making a different decision. And so I'm just thinking about the kind of the clear communication, because that's a significant amount of resources that we're not looking at.
So I would say from that communication standpoint, yes, that's part of me being a part of the committee and helping to ensure we're bringing those conversations in. You mentioned education. We thought there might be an interest there. In your appendix on page 34, we actually break down, just as an example, the K-12 buckets so that you can see the dollars that came in under CRF and ESSER and EANS, because those are with the board, because those dollars and almost all of those dollars that came into K-12 education came in under those pre-existing federal categories. They don't have, they have discretion in the way that the plans that a particular district implements it, but they came in with their own set of criteria. And KSDE has set up a process by which those, all of their districts are applying and submitting their plans to access their ESSER dollars that fall in line with those guidelines and priorities and so forth and so on. So that decision-making of how those dollars are spent is not, and that's why for many of those shaded buckets, it's not discretionary at all. Like they're coming in, in certain programs, it's a expansion of SNAP or it's an expansion of, so they're already tied, even like the child block grants, like it's tied to an existing program in many cases that already had a certain set of criteria, but under the relief bill, they may add an additional criteria, or in some cases, they may loosen a criteria, making a particular program a little bit more widely eligible in terms of for that. Under normal circumstances, a person wouldn't be eligible to access it, but they've changed the criteria for the new funds that they're putting to a federal existing program. So the decision-making on those other ones doesn't sit with recovery, that monitoring and trying to flow that information. And so any of those blue buckets that you see, or any of those shaded buckets, we actually can produce for this group like a one-pager that breaks down what's in them and where it's going. At a certain point, it became information overload. We specifically pulled out education because we thought it might be of interest, but can do those for other areas, for background, for the executive committee. And as we start to move into other priority areas, the idea would be, let's say, for example, there is a working group that's working in education going forward. We would work with that group in particular to really do the deep dive and pull more of this detailed information so that they can see the scope of all the relief dollars that have been coming through as they think about making recommendations in relationship to, say, what this group then does. Does that make sense?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Other questions or comments from the committee? Okay, let's keep rolling.
Yeah. All right. I got to flip back in my deck. All right, so this is just a beginning of a conversation, because this really about this idea of guiding principles, I think is an important one. When we started last time with CRF, to be honest, it was about emergency, right? So the principles were around like just keeping Kansans safe and, getting the dollars out where they were being impacted. But we learned, really as we go into these dollars, there's a few things here that I'm pulling information from and feedback from legislators and former Spark members, community members, business leaders, local government partners, to get us to at least start to think about, as we start these conversations, thinking about what a set of guiding principles could look like. So here is a beginning of a list. It is not exhaustive, but based on what we learn is what we put together in terms of, again, starting at making sure that programs are sustainable and impactful, but with leveraging the one-time investments, but also being very mindful of not creating things that are going to have future dependencies on state budgets. We heard that loud and clear. You will see other things that I've mentioned before, including maximizing partnerships and ensuring flexibility. We do believe that those will be critical, but also thinking about that long-term systemic impact. Where can we use dollars that really are going to have systemic change for Kansans and change and transform communities where possible with these impacted dollars, and also equitable opportunities and outcomes and considerations. Certain programs may lean in one area, but as we look across a priority area, we want to make sure that things are not leaning towards one community or another, and that, again, because of how the guidance is written, thinking about communities that were disproportionately affected by certain aspects of COVID. And that can open up so many different conversations and opportunities in the state of Kansas, so that as we begin to have the conversations about where we want to invest these dollars, that's part of the consideration, so that it's not leaning in one community or another, one part of the state or another, one type of county or another, one community or another, that is also part of that consideration. So I just want to stop right there and just make sure that if there's any questions, but the idea here is that this is just, we start by gathering and pulling feedback on what are those things that, no matter what we're talking about, no matter what bucket is, no matter what the investment looks like, we want to be at the heart of the principles that are driving how we make those. So,
Speaker Reichman.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I hope we can, as a body here, can get our arms around is what are our guiding principles and what are our objectives? And then measure decisions that we make going forward from that point. You know, some of us had just talked on the phone briefly about a few of those things. And like, for me, it's obviously what is the need that's based on the pandemic going forward. And what strategic investments we can make now that helps Kansas in the future. And of course, what ways can we offset future spending for SGF? Those are things that come to mind. I'm sure there's other ideas, but I like to have some understanding of where we're trying to end up. That was one of the frustrations we had with the last one. Of course, we had a lot of different conditions. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and we were rushed, and we had a much shorter runway than we have now. And so hopefully, it sounds like we are learning from that. But I think one of the things that we didn't accomplish was, where do we want to end up? And we have a tremendous opportunity to oversee these funds that can really set our state and use this information, use this resource going forward that could look back and how do we grow this industry, or how do we protect our Kansans, or what we do for our future SGF. I'm sure there's 3 or 4 other ideas that the committee may have. It's like, so every time somebody asks for money, because every time we say yes to somebody, we're saying no to something else. And we'd like to have a broader breadth of what those ideas are. I know one of the things that were frustrating last time is when we give the $400 million to the cities or the counties, it was either yes or no. There wasn't, what were the goals, what were the objectives of those counties? It was just, you have so many people in your area, this was your money. And I want to see us get away from that. And I think if we knew where we were trying to end up before we kind of got into some of the stuff, it'd help us go a long way.
Other comments from the committee? President Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just as we kind of mow through that, I would echo the sentiment of our priorities, but I think we also need to be careful about make sure we're using the same defined terminology and just making sure. So you use a word like community can mean different things to different. So are we talking geography, ethnicity, income, or is it like the food service community, right? The bars and restaurants that took a big, I want to make sure we're careful and are talking about the same things, because sometimes we use, unintentionally very generic language. I want to make sure we're all understanding as we build those priorities what we mean when we say that.
Thank you. Other comments? Questions? Okay.
So the one thing about this is that I think the way that we hope to propose it is that there's some early work to try to put some frame on some stuff, but that this is something that is going to take us longer, so that there is that opportunity for, that discussion to understand where those end goals are, but also to create space where we have more voices in helping to determine what that looks like. Can you go to the next slide? So one of the things that we did, and again, this is just a starting point. So we did some initial analysis looking at some of the things that were done under 2020 and some of the short term, some of the things that that still rise as needs in the state, but also may or may not have designated buckets of money. So here is an example of looking forward. So for instance, when we were in Spark 2020, we started in a place of, we were looking at education in many different ways because we were dealing with, emergencies. As we look forward and think about education, there's an opportunity, because there are direct dollars and even more direct dollars coming directly into K-12 and higher ed. There's not necessarily a pre-designated bucket that is coming out of these dollars in, let's say, the early child development space. So trying to do some of what Speaker Reitman was saying, of trying to early identify some of the needs that kind of pop out as we knew this was a need, we addressed some of it the first time, it is a ongoing need, and there may be a gap. That may not be the only one, but it's one of the examples of some of the analysis that we've started to do in a couple of buckets. Public health is another one. There's a lot of dollars that are coming in around public health, particularly in relationship to the pandemic, response to the pandemic, and building back after the pandemic for the spaces that were impacted because of the pandemic in the healthcare spaces. So whether that's to local health departments or things like that, there's just different pockets in the larger health space, but there's not dedicated dollars, pre-dedicated dollars coming in another bucket in the behavioral health space. And we know from what we saw last year that there is a need there, still an ongoing need. So that also could be an opportunity in there, particularly thinking about how are dollars already being used in the public health space, and is this a gap, right? So this is the kind of, as we were looking at beginning to frame in those areas. Essential needs is also one of those areas that the first time around, we pulled out certain dollars for certain things. So we actually pulled out dollars from our large discretionary bucket to deal with rental assistance. In the new bills, rental assistance is pulled out directly, has its own dedicated dollars, right? But it has certain caveats around it. How are we leveraging those dollars? Is there another part of essential needs that those dollars can be leveraged into, or is there a different part of the housing and food conversation around essential needs that the discretionary dollars could be leveraged into, because we know rental assistance, and there's also a homeowner assistance part that is coming as well as a part of ARPA, right? So again, trying to do, I think some of what was expressed here is as we start down this path, creating some higher level buckets to be able to begin to explore what was done. What dollars do we know are tagged into certain priority places already? And then where are some potential gaps or areas of priority that we could take the conversation? So if you go to the next slide, and this is just as we started to cull out and pull out different things. Again, not an exhaustive list, but an idea of a design of taking these priority areas as our starting point, knowing that there may be work that spins off in a different piece of a direction or a deeper dive in a particular area, but that these still resonate as some of those key common areas and spaces for our conversations to launch or begin. And as you can see, I mean, many of them are, I don't want to say standard, because they're not necessarily standard as much as just those key pieces that we all talk about in these particular areas that we do work on day to day. But how they've played out and how they've been funded up to this point, or could be funded, is the questions and the opportunities I think that we have as we mold this process. So the next slide gives quick overview as making sure everyone is on the same page per this process. Oh, question, yes, sir.
President Masterson.
Before we jump on, because I know we're jumping into process there, because one thing that did jump out at me, and I like, you know, refining what we're doing, is that jump kind of from just education to early childhood development was one of the things. Like in Wichita alone, there are hundreds of kids that are basically missing from the educational system after the shutdown, right? I think, and we talked last year, we talked about education enrollment statewide is down 18,000 kids. Some of those parents did something else, but there seems to be one of our priorities in education, whether that's them using it, is the recovery of those kids that have left the system, right? These are the kids that are on a precipice of being productive in society or not, and then we've got expenses in that whole side of things. So I just want to, the early childhood thing jumped out as me, a sense of, you know, that definitely is a long-term thing. You know, these kids that might need pre-K versus the immediate of these lost kids that are they're right now walking the streets and nobody knows where they are. So.
And thank you for that. There is, and so this is where, as we start to dive into some of these spaces, it'll be important where we marry it with what KSDE is, because there's actually a component of some of their plans that actually addresses just that, like where they're asking districts and communities to think about how are you addressing loss? How are you addressing, you know, encouraging districts to have, to be able to use or leverage those dollars and actually encourage them to think about how do you do recovery in the educational space, and both for those that might have stepped out of the educational space, but also we know that it may be some gaps in the gains that were missed this year because of hybrid and different things, and just the impact of the pandemic. So what we're seeing in some of the plans from the district is a little bit of both. It's the recovery of those that stayed in and trying to ensure that they don't lose, but then also plans of how to reclaim those that they have lost. So that's where it's a great example of being able to marry with KSDE to see what's happening. And then there could be an opportunity to say, there's still a slither here, right? But then as we look at that slither, depending on what it is, then the question becomes, is there a way to leverage both the state and then potentially local dollars to be able to achieve that piece? That's why this is gonna be a little bit, like, last time we could like come up with a list of things and we're like, well, this just needs to be done because we gotta get ventilators out, or we gotta, gotta move this out, or we gotta get testing out. This is going to be a little bit of a puzzle, but it'll be worth the work if we really can put those pieces together in a way where we are addressing things like that. There is a call out here for early child development. We pulled that as an example of where there was a clear piece where there wasn't a designated necessarily pot of dollars as an example of a priority in that space. Doesn't mean the education space has to just stay there, but then it has potential for other pieces of it. There's also in this piece of education where we didn't see as much investment, workforce development in terms of tech and trade. And there's pure opportunity there as well. That is not necessarily called out strictly in the dollars that are coming through, and an opportunity that might land in education, but it also might land in the economic revitalization conversation. In both, could be in either or a combination of buckets. Make sense?
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so this is the structure of the Spark process, so that everyone, just again, ground setting or level setting. The State Finance Council has final authority of the use of funds. This committee will make recommendations to that State Finance Council that they will consider. And there's an advisory committee that brings a larger body to the table, and this was the structure of the former Spark. But one of the things in trying to address some of what we heard and learned was that we are proposing that there's kind of one more bucket or layer that sits not just the advisory committee, but that as we identify our areas, can you flip to the next one for me? Like, as we identify, for example, our areas of priority, economic revitalization, health, behavioral health or health, education, early child development, whatever that looks like, that education bucket, but that we also create space for working groups that can do these deep dives, that can start to look across various buckets of dollars and opportunities and needs, and be able to, and you build these groups with, legislators and business community and advocates and nonprofits, and we give them the data that we know and the data that we need and the analysis that we have, as well as the expertise that they bring from their respective fields and the knowledge and the work that they do, so that we are generating the actual proposals, initiatives, ideas that then roll up to the Spark Committee to be discussed, formulated, refined, that then come before the final exec committee before, kind of whether it's buckets or, sets of priorities are taken forward to be able to frame, right? This, our goal here is trying to create that space so that we're having the experts in the room that can do the deep dives, that can bring the perspective and bring the voice, but then being able to, and giving them scope and scale, but then continuing to roll it back up so that at every level there's a little bit more scope and scale. So if I'm working in, economic revitalization, that group is gonna have their heads down in that space. But when it rolls up to the advisory group, now the advisory group can take, advisory group with the exec can take a broader view of like, okay, as we look at economic revitalization and education and health across these areas, this is what it looks like. there's two grayed out buckets here, and they're not grayed out because they're not priorities, but potentially a different, slightly different approach. One is government operations, and in this bucket, again, this is more facility modernizations, IT, cybersecurity. This is something that we're proposing more of like a interagency, state agency group that could put together ideas. Some of them are going to be generated out of things that came out of session last year that we're told to look at to see if federal funds were eligible and things of that nature that could still bring what they've learned and their recommendations back to the larger advisory group as an idea and could go back and forth. So a little bit different than, say, some of the other areas. The other is in connectivity. There is and I apologize, I meant to.
Secretary, before we go on.
Yes.
Speaker Reichman?
Sorry.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm looking at the structure you propose, and I'm not saying that I'm against it. I'm just, a couple things brought my attention. First is the amount of appointees by the governor, and you're referencing that it was actually put in Senate Bill 159. I don't remember Senate Bill 59. I think it set this committee up and said.
It did, and that was our error when we built that, and so that wasn't directly in it. It set this committee up. We were proposing another layer. So our error on that, on this printout.
This is not designated by statute. This is just your recommendation. Because our intent was that this committee would have the discussion, be the steering committee, and then drive down how we want the process to work. Not just to be an this seems like a very executive branch structure. Although you guys do have the resources and the time to do that, I'm just kind of curious if this is before we get too far down, this is the type of structure we envisioned as steering committee members, or if there's another avenue, because again, the statute didn't line this out, and especially the governor making all the appointments. I'd like to see that in statute if I'm inaccurate there.
President Masterson?
Obviously, being the other half of the legislative branch, that I would concur with that sentiment. It's not exactly the structure that was envisioned, although, I mean, again, not opposed to some structure like this. We'll just probably, as we get into the discussion of what this looked like, because those are the two questions I literally go, what's the advisory committee makeup? And who makes it? What are these working groups? Who makes up the membership of these working groups? Because as we all know that have seen recommendations come forward, I mean, you can end up with a situation where all the recommendations are going one direction, and you got choice A or choice A. So.
And one of the things, and I will say, it's hard to do in pictures. So while part of it, as we were thinking through pieces, it looks like it's stacked, and so they're separate. They're not necessarily designed to be separate, where executive members and advisory group members are actually a part of working groups and in those conversations. And so it's not like one layer does something, then it rolls up, and then the next layer does something, and then it rolls up, and then the next layer, but that this is probably more reflective of where the decisions sit, where the working group would be more of being able to generate from a particular space with a lot of varying voices. That advisory group would have members from the working group that would sit on the advisory, as well as the exec being a part of those working groups. And so that then there's a different level, that higher, that full committee being able to debate more holistically across multiple areas, with at the end of the day, and again, exec being fully a part of those conversations, and then, but at the end of the day, that last round of recommendations truly coming out of exec. So sorry for the pictorial of looking like it's separate as much as the rolling up of decisions, but the opportunity at every level to be a piece of it. And again, part of this was not necessarily to exclude, but trying to find a space for how do we bring in more voices, have those voices informed, be able to give them some guiding principles, some priorities around what we want our outcomes to be, and then letting them do some of that work that then can come up a level to be more holistically debated and refined. So again, this is proposals of trying to help this group think about how do we structure this and start to get some work done, and maybe it evolves as we move through it as well. But how do we get a few voices and hands into some of what's in these spaces to get us moving?
It sounds like, if you'll excuse the analogy, I'll be right with you, Mr. Orman. This is not so much of a layer cake as it is a marble cake, where it's intertwined. Mr. Orman.
I do think someone has to excuse that analogy, but I applaud the effort to try to bring diverse voices to it, and frankly, I think diverse voices and intellectual conflict are candidly the key to getting to the best answer. I would echo, however, the sentiments that both Speaker Reichman and President Masterson said, which is, ultimately, if we don't have deep input into that set of alternatives, effectively, the Spark Executive Committee becomes redundant with the State Finance Council. And then you have to ask yourself the question, what was the legislative intent behind setting up the Spark Committee in the first place, if it wasn't to do something other than what the Finance Council does? And so I think as long as we can structure this in a way where there's a lot of input from this committee into the goals, into the priorities, and then, working to help make sure that we get a complete set of options so that we're considering the whole range of policy alternatives, I think it could work quite well.
Thank you. Any other comments from the committee? Speaker?
Again, I'm not saying this is not a good structure, but I do believe this committee needs to set the priorities for these groups if they're going to go this direction and have a say in who's involved with those groups. I don't see us saying, yeah, look, we think that one branch of government should select all these members. And so however you guys have worked it out, would be my recommendation that we have some say. If we want to go this route, there may be a different idea that comes forward as far as the structure, if it's the marble cake or whatever you want to do next time. Whatever that structure looks like. Just some more buy-in from us. Again, this is a first blush draft, get it. Just wanted to, again, this is not, I don't believe this is what we had in mind when we put this in the bill.
I think this is precisely why we're here, to have these conversations. This is the first meeting. We're going to figure this out together and come to a process that works.
And part of it will be realistic on timing. Some of the dollars have hit the state, and some of our partners, like in the local spaces, they're also having similar conversations. And it's summer, and competing challenges and priorities. And so I think when we initially mapped this out, we felt that our first meeting would probably be like maybe mid-July to give us time to have some of this back and forth. Key members of this committee will be on vacation and unavailable, and we didn't want to miss the opportunity to kick off the conversation and to start the feedback and not be in August and not have at least started, how do we want to look at it, or what things should we be collecting, or who should we be collecting early on, to even be able to bring the larger group back together and say, well, here is the analysis that's been done in the needs assessments, and here's a starting place for us. So please know, and that's why I started this section by saying it's proposed. From our standpoint, part of the challenge is that it can get unruly, and the intent is to figure out ways that we're creating structure that gets you the information, as you can see, which is layered in so many ways, in a timely fashion, which we always aren't able to do, but we try our best, and that we're getting the right information so that those decisions can be made. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I will say is the next few slides are examples, because what we were trying to show is how this could work. And so please understand again that this is not, we're not saying that like this is out the gate. It's the idea of between working groups and bringing the full committee together, we can have work being done, right, on a particular area, doing deep dive, doing analysis, pulling information that can then continue to then roll up and move our process through. So we have a little bit of work that we believe we can do in July to kind of level set or to get some foundational. And then as we come back into like that August, we can run through the fall as much as we need to then refine and set and push in to particular areas. just to give you a sense of it. But the idea of that some of this work is happening kind of back and forth or in parallel is something that we thought about to be able to keep conversations moving and also to be able to feed information. But again, depending on if we tweak that structure, there might be a different way that that could play out. This is just one example that we were trying to show how the structure could work. All right. The last couple of slides in this section is just, I wanted to give, can you go forward for me? And then we are done with this section. So the last few slides are actually about the Office of Recovery. And so one of the things that we want to know for this group is that whatever the process deems out at the end, the Office of Recovery is basically like the staffers for it to make sure that materials are being pushed, the logistics behind it, background overall, helping to pull together that stakeholder management, not making necessarily the decisions in it as much as managing information and flow, and also continuing to push out dashboards, communications, websites, things of that nature. But as this process evolves, if there are other pieces that sparks like we want a X, Y, and Z, that's what the office will work to do. That's where the dashboard came out of last time. Someone mentioned, well, it'd be nice to be able to see how the dollars are moving, you know, from my county perspective. And we worked, and over the period of time, we're able to do that. So just wanting to highlight, like, it's this piece of what recovery does is to support the process that is structured by this group for Spark. Additionally, can you go forward a slide? So just as a reminder, the Office of Recovery in that left panel you see shows the Spark support. That office, as I mentioned a minute ago, is also supporting the local governments. It's also supporting the state agencies. It's also ensuring that our reporting arm, which is key and critical from a budget perspective and a compliance perspective. We have quarterly reports for all of these federal funds that started when these dollars came in. They're not ending. Under ARPA, there's new reporting requirements that we just got a new set of them yesterday, and we're still trying to go through them and understand them. There are interim reports, the first one due August 2021, and there are annual reports with key performance indicators. So all of that reporting, as well as the reporting we do internal to the state, the state budget committees ask lots of questions around where the dollars are and all of that. We start with kind of single source of truth with that data that is pulled in there, and then we parse it out to answer questions. So this just shows you kind of the larger scope and scale of recovery, just for reference sake, to understand like Spark is one piece of it, but that office is also supporting all relief dollars moving through the state in some capacity, and the state of Kansas's responsibility around those dollars in relationship to compliance, reporting, transparency, and communication in some shape, form, or fashion. Make sense? That's the end of this section. So I will turn it over to the chair to see. There's some definitely feedback that we've gathered that we can tweak around, but I do want to make sure at some point we talk about next steps as we think about the next few weeks and what we can or cannot do and how we start to move some of this conversation forward so that we walk out of the meeting knowing what those pieces are in relationship. Naturally, the advisory committees and if we take, the advisory committee is a piece of the structure. If we go the route of working groups, whether they're formal or informal in some way, being able to compose those and to get feedback into those is definitely a piece, but I also want to make sure if there's any other things that we need to think about as we wrap up this piece.
Comments from the committee? Questions? Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate this work and this structure. Again, the questions I would have is, can we decide what our guiding principles are? What are we want to, when we designate some of this money, it's going, okay, it's hitting that bucket, it's hitting that area. And if we can identify as a group what we think those are, I think it'll make the process easier when, especially all the requests are becoming our way. Then the other thing is just, again, you mentioned the amount of money, had to be allocated by December of 24, spent by December of 26. Is that both tranches, or is that just the first?
Yes, that's everything.
Okay, so we clearly have a lot of time. We have until December 2024 before we have to allocate anything. So there's not a rush to make these decisions, unless there's a need that we've been identified. But for me, even before we get to that area of making any decisions, it's like, where do we want to end up? And what are our goals and objectives? And that's kind of that's how my mind would process, be able to make any decisions going forward.
Thank you. Mr. President?
Yeah, I think I would just echo that. And I think, we could probably, I know these proposed timelines, we could probably fit another meeting or two in to have some follow-up, right? I mean, that's a lot we were all handed a, 50-page slide deck, 18 hours before, maybe 18 hours, and had to sleep between that, right? I agree with the speaker. Our time is probably best spent working on what our priorities are and what that structure is first, because that really does set the tone for everything else and how we're going to develop these working groups. We probably need to have some, questions around even the suggestion of informal is probably better. And because I'd be interested in how, as we move through this process, things like COMA may apply as we talk, because talking about priorities, I mean, open meetings is about not making decisions that the public isn't aware of. So as long as I think there can be conversations with working groups about potential things that but we don't want to run afoul of any of that. But I believe those, especially if they're informal, can have, meetings where the entire working group is sitting there talking about potential recommendations. And then we can have conversations about priorities, because we wouldn't accept those until we come in and had a full committee discussion about what those may look like. So I would think we might need to put a little more time into versus just right now, today, we're going to decide what exactly the priority is, who's going to be on what. We probably need to squeeze another meeting in here somewhere.
Go ahead.
Mr. Orman?
And I would actually see that as being consistent with what the chairman said at the beginning, that we've got to be thoughtful here, make good, innovative decisions. And so ultimately, I think we're all saying effectively the same thing. It would be helpful to me as someone who hasn't participated in a process like this before, however, to have some real clear guidelines on what we can and can't do in terms of communications, what we can and can't do in terms of meetings. I understand any email that goes to you would be subject to the Kansas Open Records Act and other things, but I think it would just be, frankly, for me personally, helpful to have some guidelines for what you can and can't do, just to make sure that this process is, as transparent as possible and consistent with the law.
That point is well taken, and Recovery Office, can we get a written guidelines to all the committee members so that there's clarity about what the law is and what the rules are?
So it sounds like that, if I can ask my fellow executive committee members, that if we can try to grab another meeting in the next couple of weeks to try to continue this part of the conversation, and in particular, it might be virtual, that just because I do know that there are people going to be in different places, and so if that is amenable, we can see what we can do in that space. And it may be if there's an opportunity to do some direct gathering and try to compile a few things beforehand. And so, Speaker, if there's a couple of things where you're like, this is a key principle or this is a key objective I want in there, we might be able to gather a few things and start here, add some things to it, and then kick something back out to use the time effectively. Is that?
Well, and I might, to the speaker's question, which I think is the right one, where is it we want to end up? That's got to be our guidepost that drives all of this. I think that the timing issue is important, both the sense that we don't want to rush this, but, and while we don't have a legal requirement to have the funds obligated until 2024, there is a practical both need and opportunity that exists right now in some settings. And so we've got to strike the right balance between moving with a sense of urgency, but also not rushing this. And so we'll figure out scheduling to continue this very important conversation to make sure that we're on the same page. Given that, so we're at kind of the midway point, I believe, on the presentation. Is that correct? Why don't we take a 10-minute recess, and we'll reconvene at 3:40. Thank you. If I knew, I would tell you, but I actually don't know the answer to that one. Okay, welcome back. We've got about an hour and 20 minutes to go in our allotted time, and Madam Secretary, can we get that done?
My hope is that we don't take all of it.
Okay, even better.
Do our best. So this next section is actually administrative items that we're bringing forward for recommendations to State Finance Council. What I will say to this group is, first and foremost, as we realized some of the deadlines that we were coming up against and things of that nature, and realized we were having this meeting this week, we worked to put this together. Our intent is to get this information out to you faster and sooner, and where possible, also to make sure that we're providing as much background as possible. These first few, and I do believe as we go forward, as we just talked about in designing the Spark process, the recommendations will more organically flow up. There will be some administrative things, but in general, we see recommendations coming because we've been working towards them. This set that I am presenting this afternoon are more administrative, are cleanup. You'll see some of them are in relationship to CRF because things changed, and we just don't have another mechanism because that process kind of stopped. So it was determined it was best to bring them here before we took them to State Finance Council, just because that original CRF mechanism is no longer there, and this is the mechanism we have now. So with that, if you can go forward for me. So what we are looking at is there are a set of things that we would like for consideration in relationship to moving our process forward, this entire process forward, as well as some of the CRF cleanup, as I mentioned. So I'm going to walk through each of these. I will stop after each because I'm sure there will be questions and try to talk through those, and then decide that as a executive committee, we decide how we want to handle them, move them forward, modify them as written, so forth and so on. Can you go forward for me? We're going to start with the funding for townships, or the MCDs, the minor civil divisions. So this actually speaks to the conversation we started earlier, which is why it took me a minute to get to this part of my deck. As you can see, it's towards the back as you started to ask those questions. So going back to that earlier conversation, the 105 counties got dollars directly. There were also 10 municipal cities that got dollars directly, and the incorporated places, the 614, were directly identified by Treasury as eligible. We then, as a state, because of the nature of our minor civil divisions, were specifically called out in Treasury with 7 other states. So this wasn't we determined, like they said, these 8 states, you must undertake a facts and circumstance test to determine the eligibility of all of your minor civil divisions. Our team actually went to all of the federal webinars, but Treasury actually met with our team directly to make sure that we understood guidance and this additional step that we had to undertake. We'd work with the league and the association. We tried to make sure we were understanding all of our options and what this looked like, and did a number of different calculations to understand. So there's a piece of this, as I mentioned, the dollar amount that was approved for non-entitlement units could not be changed. So what happens is, depending on if the minor civil divisions were included or not, it would actually change the distribution of what each entity would get. It wouldn't the actual dollar amount was fixed, however, from Treasury. We couldn't just say we want to increase that dollar amount to those NEUs from the Treasury dollars. So in looking at this, we had to look at eligibility. In eligibility, we looked at their legal and operational capacity to accept the funds, as well as per Treasury guidance that these entities had to provide a broad range of services that were allowable under ARPA. And what Treasury, one of the ways that they said that this could be done was through a categorical exclusion. And so the approach that we took was that those minor civil divisions, we categorically denied the entire group. That one allowed us to maximize the dollars that were coming for Treasury into the 614 incorporated places, first and foremost. Secondly, there was another caveat to this because none of it is easy. So it wasn't even just about the inclusion or exclusion and if they're legal and operational and the broad ranges of services. There was another criteria in the way that the dollars had to go out, in that the dollars that received in any entity, so if we had included many of those minor civil divisions, could not exceed 75% of their budget allocation. And so because of that, some of those entities, their budget is really, really small because it's just for roads. And so of that dollar amount, we would have had to take the large dollar amount divided by that over 2,000 entities, and then for each individual entity, map it to their 75% mark, and anything that was above the 75% mark went back to the feds. So with all of that calculation, it also meant that 25 million would have been going back to the feds because of that calculation. So with that, and I explain all that because what's in front of you today is a slight tweak. The 167 that was distributed by Treasury could not be increased or moved, and it was just for any use. As we started to do this work, as I mentioned early, many of the minor civil divisions do not have broad ranges of services that would even ARPA eligible. So there's not a lot in their budget that would make them, that they could use it for. There are a handful, some of our larger, not large, but larger in this category, townships or entities that have things like fire and EMS, which are eligible, and other initiatives or projects that could be eligible. So the idea as we looked at this was, while we could not do anything with the Treasury distribution, there could be an opportunity with the state discretionary funds to do a set aside to allow for some of those minor civil divisions that could make the case that they had a broad range of service and could apply for a specific set of dollars in relationship to doing a project or initiative in their space. We would keep all of the necessary guidelines, so it would still be at the 75% mark. It would be similar to the dollar amount per population that they would be eligible to request, things of that nature. And so we do have to design the outline of the program, but the idea here being that we set this aside. The other thing, and Speaker Reichman mentioned this before, remember we're not on as short of a time period. So there are a couple of townships we know right now that are interested and ready, but this is something that if we opened it up, we could open it up in different phases, do some now, in 6 or 8 months, as some others have looked around, figured out a few things, learned about other dollars coming into their region. There could be another round that you open up to allow those that didn't apply the first time to apply at a later date. We selected a dollar amount of up to 20 million based on the numbers and percents. If you were actually to allocate equally across all of the groups, it's closer to maybe 30, 32 million. So we kind of not quite halved it, but just took an up to amount. So this means that if these dollars aren't requested by that township, or any of these entities and aren't utilized, at a future point with Spark, it could be reallocated or used in a different way. But this at least allows us coming out the gate as many of these entities, so the 614, the non-entitlement units, they will start receiving their money in this July. We are in the process of right now of verifying and going through their verification process, and we will start pushing out those dollars. For those townships that are ready now, to be able to also say to them, yep, in the next 30 to 60 days, you'll have an opportunity to request some as well so that they can get moving. And so that is the impetus for this particular request. Can I answer questions?
Mr. President?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So is this, just for my own clarity, the rationale bullet point, like 4 there said 25 million plus would have been returned to the Treasury? Is this the same $20 million? Is this a different pot? What?
So actually nothing was returned to, nothing returned.
What?
So because we did the calculation where we only used the incorporated places, we actually were able to keep all dollars in Kansas.
So this is just the 20 million from the pot. Now, is this from the pot, the 1.6 that we're talking about?
Yes. So the request is because those are discretionary to the state, we have the control to say, yeah, let's take a piece off and hold it as a set aside for them to apply. It's not an automatic. The entities will not receive it directly. They will have to meet the eligibility and the requirements and those types of things. So we would basically design like a grant type of program where they could then apply for those dollars so that they could go out for those that could qualify.
So this is it unallowed for there to be assistance from, the state and local have $1 billion that were separated, right? And all these are going to be subsections of a county that received dollars. I've got questions around, do we need to take 20 million out of this 1.6 where we've got $1 billion sitting at the local level and there's a very strong county interest to help their own townships?
So in that case, it could be something that in that program design to be able to ask them, based on the project that you're looking for funding for, have you worked with or had the conversation with your local, and is there an opportunity to match or something like that? We could definitely build that into the program design.
You'd want to match and let them use some of their direct dollars for us to be matched, for us to maximize number one thought there. But I'd still like to see a determination whether or not the local entity itself can manage this and not need an excess from the state.
Mr. Speaker?
Thank you, Secretary. I think this is a good example for the kind of highlight some of the things I was talking about earlier as far as before we start making decisions, where do we want to end up? And I think you mentioned that, we mentioned earlier, we just got this information last night at 6 o'clock. And so it just seems pretty complicated for us to make a decision now based on a little bit of information we do have and not knowing where we want to end up. Because my fear is that we turn around and we've piecemealed this off, we look back and where we do all that money. And again, when you're saying yes to something, you're probably saying no to something else. And so this is, to clarify what the president said, this is part of the 1.6. This is not part of the 1.67 that went directly to, or 167 that went directly to. And so, if I understand correctly, some cities received it directly. Every county did. And a lot of cities and municipalities did not. The majority didn't. But there is still money in that county, to the Senate President's point. And so, and then to come up with the $20 million, I was trying to follow your math, but I couldn't do it. Was it population-based?
I apologize. It's a combination of population-based, and then if we were to take the per person amount that actually got awarded to the 614 incorporated, right? So let's say one of these townships had, I'll just use a number so that my math works, 100 people, right? And the average dollar amount that was calculated into by NEU ended up being $151, right? So for the 614 that received the dollars from Treasury or through us from Treasury, it came out to be per their population of the 614, $151 per person. So what we did to kind of come up with a dollar amount was say, if you take this remaining 1872 of these minor civil divisions, you take their population, you times that times 151 per person, and you put their budget cap on it. If every single one was to apply for those dollars, it actually would total up to 32 million. And so we didn't come in asking for the 32, but we wanted to give ourselves a little bit of room because it could have a little bit of time. And here's one thing to keep in mind. And if we, what I will say is that if, as you mentioned, maybe not ready to have this conversation now, the only reason we are bringing this one up now was because the NEUs are starting to get their dollars, and this was a comparable group, and we're impacted by our determination of the NEUs. So we thought it was appropriate to bring it forward as the 614 starts to get those dollars. What I will say is that if this doesn't move today, I will definitely be bringing it back into other conversations, because we do know that there might be some other opportunities or ways to leverage this in the future.
Well, it seems to me that was one of my frustrations I had last time. We just kind of did it based on, because again, circumstances are different, based on a population number, not by a need or what a grant process request. And I think what I'm hearing, you want to put this money to the NIC and request. I mean, I think we could probably come up with the same thing by seeing what requests come in. And then maybe they match it with the Senate President's talking about with an actual match from the other locals. But
Agreed. And our intent was not for it to be an automatic. We use that as just, if someone said, like, how'd you come up with the number? We use that as a standard calculation, but the program design really should be about a project or initiative where they're submitting a grant request to say, here's the need we're feeling, here's why these dollars or other dollars would be necessary, here's how we fit in terms of the broad range of services, things of that nature. They could not request above a certain dollar amount based on our calculation, but that it would be more initiative or project based, not I raise my hand as X, Y, and Z entity and I just want my share or whatever that dollar amount is. So I think we're saying the same thing in that space when we do consider this.
Mr. Orman.
Thank you. I understand what you're trying to do, and I think there is a certain perceived fairness to it. So I get what's happening here in terms of that. And I do hope you do bring it up again, particularly after we've defined the objectives, where we want to go, et cetera, so that we can evaluate this in the context of those. I guess to reiterate Speaker Reichman's point, which was the first point I was going to make, is I don't think there's anything that would preclude you from starting to take requests, whether or not we've specifically allocated the money. Just understanding the sense of this committee is there should be some dollars available for those communities that did not otherwise get dollars. And so starting the process and sort of addressing those lead time issues, I think, is likely something you could do without those dollars being allocated today.
Okay. Thank you.
Next item. So this is an administrative item that, again, this is by which the only mechanism we have to bring this forward under the current structure. Last year was a little bit different. Spark hadn't actually kicked off when the recovery office was established. So there was different ways this was done, and it ended up, I think the final ended up just in front of State Finance Council, and there was conversation and it went back and forth because there wasn't necessarily another mechanism at the time. So we're bringing it here this year, and there are two pieces of it. So this is the Office of Recovery's budget. So this is the administrative budget for the Office of Recovery in and of itself. Remember, with any grant or any federal funds of this nature, we have the ability to, of course, pay for our overall like admin, overhead costs, things of that nature. We've tried to keep that down. I know the numbers may feel big, but understand also as a reminder, all the different dollars we are actually tracking on. And when you total those dollars up across all of those bills going back to that to some of those earlier slides, it's multiple buckets. So in your packet, and I actually think it might be in the appendix, is the actual budget breakdown. But what you will see is that the original budget for the Recovery Office for FY21 was approved by State Finance Council. The final that was approved by State Finance Council was $8.6 million. The Recovery Office was structured and set up to run for CRF, which was scheduled to end on December 30, 2020. So the budget was actually mapped on to specifically to run from July through January of 2021 with enough time to do general closeout, and then there was a few dollars that were left in place to do final audits and recovery like after. Naturally, one, CRF got extended past December of 2020 to December of 2021. Two, in December, just before CRF got extended or around that same time, CAA was introduced, which brought in more dollars. Subsequently, ARPA was introduced in March. So as you can imagine, instead of it being an office that was designed to run from July to January, we have now run a full fiscal year and need an adjustment to that budget in relationship to that office and the office operations. Part of this is this is not a request for dollars because the administrative dollars are there. So it's more of for budget purposes, because it's the authorization from the budget perspective. Otherwise, our budget shows that this is the approved budget and this is the spent for FY21. And then I will stop there, but as you can see, the next piece is then proposing the FY22 accordingly. So questions?
Secretary Burns-Wallace, so am I correct that these are CARES Act dollars that we're talking about here on the Recovery Office?
They're a combination of both.
Okay.
Because they are covering both. So well, they're not even just CARES, there's CARE. So there's sets of dollars that go along with the administration of the bills where we're able to charge against it. So there are some CRF dollars that'll be in play. And then as you start to move into the new fiscal, it will then tap into a piece of the ARPA dollars because of the administrative overhead. So it's
CARES Act work that's going on right now, reporting and so forth,
Yep.
That is paid for through the CARES Act.
Yes.
We have American Rescue Plan Act work that is starting today and has been going on and which needs to be authorized to continue effective July 1, and that's using American Rescue Plan Act dollars. Is that correct?
Yes, there's still a little bit, there's probably, depending on how it lands, a little bit of CRF, because remember, any CRF, particularly any of the little of the administrative dollars we have left, we want to make sure we spend out by December 2021. So there'll probably be a little that we can start to pay some of the ARPA with and then move into ARPA. The other thing to keep in mind is that if any other relief bills are passed, we don't have to reconfigure to match those, but there are other administrative dollars that could be at the discretion that also flow into it. So that's one of the reasons this doesn't say one fund or another, because we can leverage against any of those relief bills that have administrative dollars for that oversight into this. Does that help?
That's helpful. President Masterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having been appropriated, you always look for those line items that move a lot. So contractual professional services, obviously that's a $2.5 million of the request in 21 and 17 million in 22. Can you just enlighten us on what the professional services are?
It's a little bit of everything. So we use, in that line, those are our consulting services. And so both in 21 and 22, currently we work with BCG, Boston Consulting Group. We also work with Whit O'Brien. Some of that is for strategy, some of that is for communication, some of it's for audit and compliance. We also have, and we'll stand up additionally in FY22, other marketing communications pieces. So those are the actual contracts that the state would go into for professional services in relationship to like delivery of this. We have facilitation in there. Widow O'Brien, for instance, has been our key service provider that has helped with our reporting and compliance in all of our quarterly reports. And they also have been the technical assistance that we've leveraged into all of the cities and into the counties the first round, and then we'll be leveraging into the cities and counties this round, just to give you an idea of our sense. I will say that line, as we go forward, is a little bit higher than probably projected, and part of that is we're trying, for as we were thinking about the budget, particularly not knowing what that federal landscape looks like, to get us here to be able to explain ARPA, we started working on it in February to be able to, they're already working jobs and helping us work through the family acts if either of those pass. So there's a ton of, with every bill, a ton of back work to even get us to a place where we can take it apart. So it's not, a lot of times it's that those expertise, they're working with Treasury, they're working with other states, they're helping us understand like what the landscape looks like, as well as operational, so.
So like groups like Boston Consulting, and I'm not condemning them, but I mean, last year it looked like we paid $5 million to make something take 3 times as long and cost 5 times as much in the end with testing. So what is their role in contractual services with this? Are they're consulting on distribution or?
On everything. It can be from plan design, depending on, so for an example, as for some of the state agencies, those dollars that we talked about that come directly into them, they have caveats where an additional plan has to be submitted before we unlock it. So remember, those dollars that might be tied to an area, we can't spend it on anything else, but per the new bills, you have to submit a plan. Connectivity is one of those, for example, where a plan has to be submitted before you can even access those dollars. So as sometimes we may leverage them into those where we need a different level of expertise. There's also some of the dollars in these relief bills that are competitive grants. They also help us with those, helping us to get a competitive advantage in those grant dollars that are not automatic into Kansas, but positioning us stronger to be able to secure those dollars. But they're also working with our actual so they're working with the cities and counties in conjunction with us. They're also working with the state and agencies in conjunction with us. But then they're also helping us with operational aspects as well. So our contracts actually have multiple streams in them that identify the different streams of the work, whether it's with Boston Consulting Group or with O'Brien or with another entity. We try to be very clear. CRF is a great example. The way, if you think about federal reporting and auditing, if CRF had have ended in December of 2020, we still would have had a work stream that took us through October of 2021 because it takes that long for the federal cycle to close out your full reporting, for instance, right? But in our original contract, we had all other services stopping in January, and we had one work stream that was focused on that closeout that continued. So we also, when we craft, I'm switching hats for a moment to the D of A side. When we start to craft these, we try to parcel those out. So it's not just like one big contract or just like one plot of money. It actually has work streams tied to it so that we can see and separate those accordingly, because there are other things we wouldn't have needed if CRF ended, but we would have needed that continue working with both those partners with BCG and with O'Brien for the closeout of CRF, sorry. Because they, under CRF, and they still are, I just probably signed another, 15 closeout letters for the counties, because that's some of the work that's part of the CRF. It wasn't just about, because remember, under CRF, we gave the counties their money. So we are helping to ensure the counties are closing out as well as the state, because we can't close out until the counties are closed out. We can't close out until the counties have, those that need to do a single audit. We can't do ours till they do theirs. So Does
Are you
that,
still sourcing those contracts, or are those exempt in any way from kind of your normal RFP state procuring processes?
what I would say is we try to follow everything that we can along those. When we walked into this last summer in the middle of the emergency, when we first stood them up, we did go out and reach out to multiple of those larger entities. I will tell you, if you think about where we were last July, we really only were looking for entities that were already doing some of this because we just, none of us knew what we were getting into. And also that we're working with other states so that we had a comparative group of like, how are they leveraging their dollars? So, but what I can say is that as Secretary of Administration, we work hard to make sure that we are working with multiple vendors. We just stood up a master agreement that, well, it's not done. They're actually going through it right now, where we're gonna bring on multiple firms. That'll just be on master agreement, and we can use that for accounting and auditing, but also some strategy work, communications work. But we've stood this one up slightly differently in that we're opening up to making sure it's available to political subdivisions so that counties and cities that might need some work going forward have the master agreement that they can start from and don't have to do all the negotiations. And we anticipate that there'll be multiple vendors that'll sit on that one. But we learned that from last time that some of the larger counties already have these things, some of the smaller ones don't, and don't need to retain it for a long period of time and only need to retain certain services for the purposes of tracking these dollars. Does that help?
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I'm sure you answered this question, but I'm not sure I comprehended the answer. Some of this money you're asking for is going backwards. Or some of the money that we're trying to reimburse based on, or that's already been spent or approved?
Yes, so we're adjusting our FY21 budget.
Okay. But you're trying to pay back money that was spent this fiscal year behind us, last month behind us?
Yes.
Okay, so we hired folks and paid them without a source?
No, so we haven't, so what I will tell you is that there's a column here that is our projected, and I just simplified the charts. So we have actuals through May, and then we have our projected for June, and some of this has, we've moved through what we can, and we haven't the authority to move through yet. So we are trying to close out and make that adjustment accordingly.
So
And part of it is from an administrative, we were looking for the mechanism for us to be able to adjust and this was when, in the course of the conversation, we said that this would be the mechanism to bring this forward, short of the last CRF process closing.
So the ask is 22 million, correct? Am I seeing that right? Or was it 19.6? I mean, this is the issue I'll have when getting money at 6 o'clock the night before. I'm asked to even ask, I don't even know what questions I ask right now because I don't know what I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. And so that's the issue that I'm trying to wrap my arms around. And some of this is the past money, some of it is SGF money, and some of it's new money?
CRF and ARPA. So none of it is SGF. This is all either CRF or.
How much are you asking for from the past funds, and how much are you asking for from the new funds, the 1.6?
So what I will say is there is, I want to say approximately 6 million left in the administrative bucket for CRF. And then with ARPA, we haven't established any administrative spaces. So these dollars so it's not new money per se, it's the establishment of the budget and the authority to spend those administrative dollars related to these. And again, because CRF will go, it will finish out FY21, but it will go into FY22 because there are still CRF-related expenses into FY22. So like in the FY22 bucket, some of it is CRF and some of it is ARPA, because we're still doing a piece of both.
Okay, I'll try it this way. We have $1.6 billion. How much of that is, you're asking us to deduct from right now?
So for FY22, it would be about $15.
Is there, being consistent with other conversations, or decisions that you made today that are going to slow us up, stop us, things that are going to cause us harm later that just can't be discussed when we actually know what questions to ask or answer some of the president's questions? Or is this something that is, we're really going to damage the state if we don't move forward today?
So the only thing I would say is, as you were alluding to, we can't enter into anything going forward as we move into the new fiscal if we don't, and it will hold any of our administrative related work.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Pickard.
I've got a couple questions. Given that 90% of the budget is professional services, I think it'd be helpful to kind of maybe get a breakdown of the contractors and maybe just a general understanding of the scope of their services by contractor, so we have some idea as to what they're doing. I mean, you've done a pretty good job of explaining it, but it would be helpful to just kind of see it in black and white.
And we can do some projections of that because not all the contracts that we will need for FY22 are even in place. What we found over this last year is that there are some that we walk into the year with, and there's others that we may need depending on what Spark decides to do, what operations we stand up, and so trying to build into the budget to be able to support the types of functions that we know may have that. But yes, that can be, we can give an example of what we have and what we used over the last year to give a sense of what could and what we believe would sit in that bucket.
And the fiscal year 22 budget's almost doubling the fiscal year 21 amount spent. And I was wondering, is there a lot of carryover from the first year that are going to get paid in the second year? Or do we have a lot of accumulated unpaid fees?
Not so much. So understand that CRF was just at $1 billion, and it was all state controlled. And ARPA alone is that's coming in as 1.6, that's discretionary, plus the dollars coming into the agencies, plus the dollars in supports that is going out to the counties and cities. So trying to scale, and also trying to scale in a way that with any additional federal relief dollars, that we have that capacity to just absorb what we have, and we've put the proper structures in place to, if another one rolls in, we already have everything there that can support it in a similar way. So if that helps.
Sure. So the consulting services not only cover the Spark money, but all the grayed out boxes on that chart, as well as all the pass-through funds to the
Yes, sir.
that were passed through from the state. Okay. Thank you.
Other questions from the committee? Okay.
Item number 3, can you go for it? Oh, yep, you're there. Yep. All right, so this is a CRF-related issue, and again, we're bringing it here because we don't have, this was the mechanism that was in front of us. One of the things that happened, and this is under the proposed funding source, for those who remember under CRF and our process, there were various things that for around the emergency that were FEMA eligible, right? Just like in any other emergency. In standard cases, there is a state contribution of 25% on FEMA. And so what we did and what was approved through the Spark process originally through CRF was that those dollars were allocated to KDEM to be able to pay the state's contribution, which allows us to get the other 75% paid for by FEMA. And it's the way that the FEMA eligibility, I mean, it was things like PPE, but there were all kind of other categories. But at the end of the day, the standard FEMA calculation for going into it, the guidance when the pandemic started was a 25% state contribution. So under round 3, we allocated the money to KDEM so that they knew that they had the state's 25% portion to be able to pay so that they could go forward. FEMA works on a reimbursement, like you spend those monies in those spaces, then you apply for it and it gets reimbursed and you have to apply your portion to it. It's not a quick process and it's a kind of a long process to get through and very layered. What happened, and this is, as I alluded to earlier, about changes in guidance and changes in federal landscape, so as we moved through the pandemic last year and everything in relationship to FEMA and all of that, that 25% held. In February of 2021, the FEMA guidance changed and they reduced the 25% state contribution down to 0 per the nature of the emergency. They've done this sometimes in the past. It doesn't always happen. And we didn't want the state to be in a situation where we assumed it might happen later and not have the dollars necessary to pay that contribution. With that, what opened up is so that those dollars that were given to KDEM to pay the state contribution were no longer needed by them. So those dollars are now able to be recouped and reallocated. If some of you may remember, all of our CRF dollars were allocated somewhere. So like this is a pot of money that if you were to look at our roll, it doesn't show as being available because it was allocated to the FEMA. It just hadn't been fully expended yet because it hadn't triggered off for them to pay. As they started moving through, realized they won't be spending it, it now becomes back. So this is and we did this throughout the process, but it was like smaller dollars as we moved stuff around last year at various times. We would recoup money and then it would just get shifted to another program. All of our programs are pretty much closed out. There's a few key pockets where there are still dollars, but again, those dollars are allocated. We may not have paid the bills yet. This is one because of the change in the FEMA guidance in February. Now, I have to caveat, I know you may see, it changed in February, we're just now hearing about it. It literally took them probably until a few weeks ago to get all of the clear guidance from FEMA for all the various states to understand that, yes, it was 100% certain that the categories that they had identified had moved to 0. And so in making sure that they had the right categories and all of those things and following those changes in the FEMA guidance, because what came out in February was everything goes to 0. Well, as you know, with a process, they then had to work with FEMA to make sure. So we're talking this line item. No, we're talking, oh, nope, that's over here. This stays in. That counted, this didn't count. So once we got to the kind of end of the day, there was approximately right around 23 million that was allocated to KDEM for the state's contribution that has now been recouped. So we have taken it back and it is sitting in an account and it is able to be reallocated.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it's nice. So this is all CRF. It's not part of the 1.6. That's good.
This is all CRF, yes, sir.
In the description, it says continued surge support. So I'd like to know, are we going over to the trust fund to be additional support for supporting, the fraud that came out of that? And we've allocated the 250 million. Is this now, in effect, we put 272 into support what was lost by the business community in that fund? Or is this more operations? We got 1,500 more call service people and we're accruing costs to take in calls. And so is this, and so if B is the case, these are
It's
accrued,
B.
so are we accrued costs from what we've done doing? So it says continued support. And is that surge expected to continue? Now, and this is a little politics in nature. Our chambers both passed massive resolution, I mean, huge majorities, that said, please pull out of that expanded kind of perverse incentive for employment, that extra expansion. So this is to support efforts in sustaining the expansion?
So first, your first part of the question, yes, it is B. It is the operational aspects. The UI trust dollars, that 250 that was a part of the bill, that's separate over here. With the original, with the original continuity of operations that was funded under the original Spark, there were dollars that were funded into KDOL that were specifically for fraud identification and mitigation efforts, surge support and staffing, that operationalizing of ensuring that we're moving, getting things paid, addressing the things that needed to be addressed from an operational standpoint. That was actually approved in the original Sparks bucket to be able to help with that operational support, right? There are, and I believe, yes. So Deputy Secretary Peter Brady from KDOL is here that can talk also about this, but part of it from more of a budget Spark standpoint. So the idea here is that we have funded into some of that surge support. That surge support is not necessarily for the quote unquote supporting the expansion of, but it is for continuing to deal with the real capacity that is still there, trying to catch up and clean up to be able to service those that are in queue now. And they still have needs and demands in that space. So I will turn it over to him and he may be able to.
So my follow-up question on that, is the dollars now available, the 22 million, match what you're anticipating expenses on the surge? Or can some of that then be used for modernization efforts or going to put in the trust? I mean, match my apple and my orange?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. So to expand on what the Secretary said, this is all operational. It's going to go towards people on the phones, people doing fraud investigations, clearing ID verification issues. At the end of the day, it's getting people continue to be paid. Your specific question about the $300 incentive, FPUC, whether or not that ended 30 days from now or when it expires on September 4th, there's still a lot of operational needs in the agency that will need to be met to pay people, to investigate fraud, to make determinations, to hear appeals on these issues moving forward. So at this point, I wouldn't say that this supports the continuation of that. Regardless of what happened with that program, this operational support would be needed.
So because 22 million seems like a large amount of money for 3 months of surge support.
It'll be beyond 3 months, Mr. President. So in addition to getting to the end of September 4th when the programs expire, there's going to be a continued need in the agency. Like I said, we're still going to be investigating fraud. We're still going to be trying to clean a lot of things up in our system, preparing for the modernization of our system. Because it's not just the modernization project. There's a lot of prep work to get everything to where it needs to be. And then finally, too, just the nature of unemployment programs. Issues can be appealed to multiple levels. So there will be appeal hearings on these issues for months and potentially years to come. And we saw that coming out of the Great Recession as well.
Other questions?
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Secretary. In the appendix, is there a breakdown of this 22 million, where it's going? I'm still kind of looking for it. Maybe it's in here.
Mr. Speaker, I don't believe it's in the appendix of that slide deck. We could certainly prepare some information as to specifically what we project it is. Like I said, the vast majority of the funding would be utilized for lack of a better term, bodies on the phone, bodies making phone calls.
And I think that's something we would support. In fact, we all lived through what happened and would like so many people not be able to get the support they were needed and what the fund was for. But we also seemed like we go through this last year and there was 50 million here and 20 million here. And there wasn't the count of what do we get for that. And so I'd kind of like to, before we make this decision, the question would be, for $22 million, where's it going? What areas? How much is outsourced? Were those sole sourced or not? Were they competitively bid? And then if the money is not spent in that area, can it be used for something else? Kind of the president's point. And so I just, again, it's not a, that I'm against any of this. It's just, there's just such little information. And it's just a short amount of time to make a $22 million decision.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, we can absolutely pull that information together. The other thing I'd add too is, because I know that you and members of your body have, lived through this experience with us, there were a lot of time periods in which it was, for lack of a better term, brutally impossible to get through the agency just because of the volume and the resources we had. You've probably seen recently, call volumes are way down, claim issues are way down. Over the past few weeks, we've answered 60 to 80% of unique calls on any given day, up to 90 on some of the best days. We're not at 100 yet. Whether we get there, time will tell. But what we want to sustain is where we are today and not revert back to where we were a few months ago.
Sure, and I remember times in the beginning of the year, we had 50, 70,000 claims a week. And I'm sure we're way down from that now. And so even be able to compare this number based on what we just went through, probably need a little more supporting documents to see. And then the second part of that question is, if it's from the past money and it's not spent, this 22 is not spent in this area, what other uses could be used for those funds, if any?
Within KDOL or in general?
This is $22 million that we're in charge of allocating for the state of Kansas. So I would, any and all.
So, so the one thing is that, and we can pull the eligibility. CRF has stricter eligibility and guidelines than ARPA, and one of the biggest is that it must be tied to, remember, direct COVID-related impact, and must be spent by December 2021. And then there's a few other caveats. So yes, it can be explored. One of the reasons, just being transparent here, we tried to look for areas that had been previously identified that there was still a need, and it's why this particular proposal came forward for these dollars. You can open that conversation back up. It can go in many different directions, but it is a lot tighter than, say, even some of the conversations we were just having about where it can be spent, because it does follow those original eligibility guidelines. But yes, it is recouped and it can be reallocated as long as we stay within the CRF eligibility guidelines.
Deputy Secretary Brady, by what date could we have that breakdown of the numbers that Speaker Reichman has asked for?
We will get that put together as quickly as possible. Obviously, keep in mind with some of the stuff discussed today, just like that, it will be projections as to what we expect that need to be, but I anticipate we can put it together very quickly.
Couple days?
By the end of the week.
Thank you. Other questions from the committee? Mr. Orman.
Yeah, just one comment on that, and I think to build on what Ron said, I suspect there's also an opportunity to put those numbers into some historical context. So you were able to accomplish a great deal with the dollars you had, and as you project forward using those same metrics, I think it'd be helpful to figure out whether $22 million is the right amount of money, or $22 million just happens to be awfully close to the 23 that we got back. And so I think putting it into historical context would be helpful.
And I will say it is actually what we got back, because we have no other CR. Their need is higher than that. We have no other CRF dollars to be able to potentially meet that. These were the only dollars. So that piece does line up in that way.
And if their need is higher, why didn't you ask for the full 23?
Because under CRF, we don't have, the full 23. Well, it's 22 and change. There's a lot of rounding that happens. So yeah.
Okay. Let's keep moving.
One more. Thank you. All right. So this is vaccine confidence, sorry. This is a proposal, and while it is a new program, the reality is that one of the buckets of the original Spark group was testing, testing has evolved, and the funding with testing and then subsequently vaccination has also evolved over this time. So we took a lot of our early CRF dollars in that last round and put towards testing. Subsequently, between FEMA and other federal dollars coming in, many things that happen in testing, many things happen in the vaccine space, but there are still some spaces where those certain dollars may or may not be eligible to do various things. This is one thing that is a continuation or a building on the earlier testing strategies of trying to get wide participation, but now we've moved into that vaccine space. This is proposed off of the CRF. Again, with the last few dollars that we have left that are in play, was a proposal to utilize these dollars in this way. This is for Dr. Marcy Nielsen, who is the Chief Advisor for COVID-19 Coordination, was on the line. Dr. Nielsen, are you still there?
I am.
She's here and can speak to kind of like Deputy Secretary Brady did to details of it. I'm going to talk operational, and then if there are other questions, she can answer. So the idea here, we found and were able to confirm that you could use CRF in this capacity. Some of the other dollars that are flowing in relationship to testing and vaccine, you can't use in this capacity. And because, again, we had a small amount of CRF that came forward and the timing, it was something that we brought forward at this time, again, taking the opportunity. This is designed in a way, there's been many different things that you may have seen out there in terms of incentives and vaccinations and lottery. The design of this program is actually focused more on the younger population with incentives around vaccine scholarships and things of that nature. So I'm sure there are questions and I can try to answer some. And again, Dr. Nielsen is on and she can answer additional.
Questions from the committee? Mr. Pickert.
Mr. Chairman, I'm curious, is this an idea that we have imported from another state, or are other states doing something similar to this, or where's this coming from? I'm curious.
Dr. Nielsen.
Yes, we have about 14 states and counting who are currently doing some variation of a lottery.
Thank you.
You bet.
Other questions or
is-
comments?
This is John Rolfe.
Yes, Mr. Rolfe.
I've been following this stuff pretty closely, and the scholarship approach seems to be effective. I haven't seen anything but the early data out of Ohio. Marcy, have you seen the efficacy if this drove in folks to take it, and what that looks like?
What we're globally seeing is that when a state first announces the lottery, you see a lot of activity. Ohio was the first, so there was a lot of activity there. Most of the states, you see a slowdown. Kansas, not unlike most states in the United States, we're really seeing a pretty significant slowdown in vaccination rates. So what I would say if I had to describe the lottery initiative succinctly is these lotteries tend to work, but they're short-term solutions. We need to have multiple different kinds of incentives in place in order to keep pushing for vaccination. This is one of the bigger ones that's gotten a lot of public attention.
Have you guys written
Arnold?
out? Oh, sorry about that.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr. Rolfe.
Have you guys written out the objectives, how the scholarships could be used? Is it the 6 regent universities, community colleges? Do you have a thought around that?
We want these scholarships to be used at Kansas institutions, both public and private, community colleges, as well as region institutions. And we're trying to incentivize trade schools as well.
Mr. Orman.
A couple of questions. One, do we have any sense for how vaccination efforts are going in this targeted community right now? As an example, have any of the Regents universities polled any of their students? Do they have a sense for what kind of vaccination rates we're accomplishing today?
Yes, I don't know that each institution is tracking it on their own students, but globally we're able to look at trends by age. What we're finding is that the younger age group really is somewhat vaccine hesitant or resistant. So this is definitely one of our key targets in Kansas.
And if we look at the Ohio example and just sort of use population numbers, Ohio being roughly 4 times larger than Kansas, and I don't know what the population numbers are in this specific demographic. If we had a comparable experience, it would sound like we would get another 10 to 12,000 kids vaccinated. Is that sort of what we're looking for here?
Yeah, it's a great question. What Ohio did was combine a cash prize with scholarships. Each state is doing things a little bit differently, so it's difficult to parse out which piece of Ohio's bump in vaccination was related to which age groups. We can certainly do more analysis and try to chunk the states by the type of lottery that they were doing. In addition to states, there are also some cities doing lotteries, both focused on cash prizes, some focused on cars or trips, so that it really runs the gamut.
And then finally, is there a reason we're effectively rewarding 1 shot when we've got vaccines with 2-shot protocols?
It's really the way in which they would qualify to participate. So anyone who has gotten vaccinated would be allowed to sign up using an online portal that connects them directly back to the state lottery program. We, of course, would be wanting to incentivize folks getting fully vaccinated, and so both shots, if you're using Pfizer or Moderna, the Johnson & Johnson is the single shot. So I would say, Mr. Orman, there's the program would be designed for fully vaccinated individuals.
Can I make a suggestion?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Is it Mr. Secretary?
Mr. Rolfe.
Okay, thank you, sir. So it's interesting to do kind of 1 million and there's 5 winners and you push it out there. I was thinking about this and I was wondering if we targeted $100,000 scholarship towards each of the 6 Regent universities, 100,000 that could go to 2 different community colleges that would be pulled, 1 that would go towards tech and 1 or 2 that would go towards independence. And then they could push out through their networks, through their channels, hey, qualify for this scholarship and win. And you actually get the word out. And I think you might get better participation, mainly because of the regional aspect of a lot of these schools and where they're pulling from and where their voices are, versus it just being a kind of the ones who get drawn win and it could all go to the same school or different places.
Yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Nielsen?
Yeah, thank you, Lieutenant Governor. I was just going to say we are open to all suggestions, so I appreciate that.
President Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and not to be the downer on it, but as we prioritize, this seems like we're doing a little bit of gambling with our 1.3 as we promote the lottery. I think there's probably, at least in my mind, 10 other better ways we could use the 1.3 million of the available CRF money. And that's just a comment more than anything else. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments from the committee or questions on vaccine lottery?
May I make one point to President
Yes,
Ashley?
Mr. Rolfe.
I'm sorry I'm not in the room and making this difficult through the web. The one thing with this Delta variant, if we can get more vaccinations, it keeps the risk to our businesses being impacted, whether people pull back and just automatically choose not to go in, or there's, some kind of local mandates that come out again. And so I do think there is some plus side to the commerce in our state, the schools, and that normalcy by targeting some of this. Whether we get the bang for the buck, I think, is a great question. But I do think it helps keep things continuous through this next winter.
Mr. President.
Thank you, Richard. Hey, John, you're right, it's a little harder over the wire. But when I say there's 10 other potential ways, I'm not saying I'm against vaccines in any way. I'm saying at 1.3 million, you could, you could give everybody 50 or 100 bucks per shot, and you're guaranteed X number versus this lottery piece. And I just think there's a whole myriad of other things you could do, even in that space.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Chairman. Again, this is for what age group? It's up to 20, so up to 24. So is that starting at what age?
So would Dr. Nielsen, I believe, is it 12 to 24?
I think that's correct.
And my thoughts on this are not, one, there's going to be a broken record here. Information on a program like this the night before, just looking at it now, I'm not sure I'm in favor of a program like this. I'm in favor of people having a free choice to have a vaccine or not. You have 12-year-old kids who it's a decision they want to make with their parents or their guardians, that I'm not sure that this is a program that's going to be helpful in them making that decision. Again, first blush, just looking at it, I'm not saying it's not a good idea, but right now I don't see the rationale for it when you're balancing out the rest of the priorities we have. Again, I think it's a personal decision. I think folks should be vaccinated, but that's their decision. And I'm not for sure incentivizing 12-year-old to do something that they haven't had a chance to talk to their parents about, or maybe they do. I have hesitancy on this.
I think what I'm hearing is we need some more data. We need more information. We need it in enough time to be able to be digested. And that's what we're going to come back with on this and other items. Mr. Orman?
And can I ask, when you do that on this vaccine program, if you could break out, to the extent it's available, the effectiveness of cash prizes versus the effectiveness of college scholarships? In large part, again, each of those appeals to a different demographic potentially. And I'm not sure what kind of vaccine uptake rates we're getting, but in those different demographics. But to the extent that we had data available that said, scholarships are significantly more effective than cash prizes, or cash prizes are significantly more effective, I think that would be relevant to this group. And maybe, Mr. President, to your question of, what's the most effective use of the dollars? So,
Dr. Nielsen, how quickly can we have that data?
We can have that available pretty quickly. We've been carefully tracking the states. I think the challenge here is that it's very early in these lotteries, and so the data will be fairly anecdotal, but I'm more than happy to go and collect it and share with you all of our findings.
We have that end of the week?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. Okay, Secretary Burns-Wallace.
All right. Stay right there for me. Perfect. All right. So from reading the room and the proposals that we have here, we've already identified areas in which we need to come back. So the one area that I would ask, and I'm now putting on my hat as a member of the committee, is I would like to put forward a motion for the consideration of the RO, the Recovery Office budgets for consideration to move forward to State Finance Council, and holding the other items to allow for additional information to be brought back to this group, either for this consideration or to roll into a future conversation and other priorities.
Got a motion discussion, President Masterson.
And maybe even a substitute motion, if it was to be amenable, would be, could we just look at the 2021 expansion until we get some of the additional information that was requested, and then you could take up the 2022 budget at a later time?
Secretary Burns Wallace, what are the implications of that?
So if we have the opportunity potentially to get the budget information back and turned around and potentially have a short meeting, it may be an opportunity if some of the other areas are ready to go to present, but so that we can get that back quickly and have that conversation, only because there is future implications for continuing work administratively in that space.
Additional discussion.
You're talking a fiscal year that ends at the end of this month?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I would second the substitute motion.
We have a motion and a second. Additional discussion?
Yeah, and again, this is, if there's things that happen that you don't think we can get together in time before July, this is, please express those. That's why I said before, if we don't do this now, what detriment to the state if it doesn't happen? Because again, our frustration with the timing of these doesn't mean we can't move forward. And so me seconding the motion doesn't mean there's not open discussion to maybe a need what happens in July, or how quickly we can turn this thing around to have another discussion.
We can do a breakdown of that aspect of, because the question with the FY22 was in the contractual services. Like, we can flip that in 24 hours.
Mr. President?
Thank you. So, I mean, to that point, so we're adding $2.5 million to a budget that ends in 8 days-ish. So I mean, so it's the only, I guess the risk would be uncertainty of the approved 20, because the services that are rendered starting in July won't be paid in July. Clearly, right? So we would have our opportunities to approve that.
Understand, though, that is also salaries and various other operational expenses related to that office. So
Do you have an underlying 22 budget? Or is this, you're saying if
So
we
remember
don't approve 22 as recommended, you don't have a 22 budget?
there is none. So that's part of the trickiness with this one, is because when this office was stood up, it was only stood up to match on CRF. So there is no 22 budget that is authorized by the legislators.
With
Does
that
make sense?
clarity, and if it's okay with my second, I would approve 21, moving forward even, and we'll discuss the excess in 22. So you would carry forward a $10.5 million budget in 22 versus
And
going.
work through the rest of the budget.
Work through the rest of the budget. So I mean, there was a bit of a doubling in that next year. I'd like to have some discussion around that.
Got it.
And get some of the information that was requested, but that doesn't leave you dry January 1. I appreciate that.
Is that?
I approve, I second the second. Wait, I approve the second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Aye.
With that, I have one more slide, and then I am done. So this is just more so of just kind of FYI. So remember, we've mentioned a couple of times the 250 that was in HB 2196. Sorry, it's a long afternoon. So this is just as a reminder. I've mentioned it a few places. We are getting ready. We will activate to move that. But because that was authorized in the House bill, we're not bringing it here, and it doesn't go before Spark. Our understanding is that the bill actually authorized the moves of those dollars. So Recovery Office will move those dollars accordingly. The 250 that is going into the UI trust fund for the first payment. But we're just trying to, for transparency's sake, awareness, this is the pot of money, the 1.6 that you all are talking about, but that's where that 250 is already called out. Additionally, they're in SB 159, There were a number of different items that were in there that by the statute said that federal funds had to be looked at and certified if they were available to pay, if it was eligible, and if they were to be certified by the Division of Budget and paid accordingly. And please forgive me, I think there may have been 4 or 5 that were this fiscal and had to be certified by June 15th. The only one that actually met eligibility or that was allowable under CRF, because that's the only dollars that were available for FY21, was part of the judicial branch's fees, and it was only 1.6 million of that. Again, the Director of Budget had to do that per statute, June 15th, certify it, and then pay accordingly. So this is just more so of awareness. There's a few more of those that are coming up, but they're later. So they're in, because they're later, they could fall out differently because both CRF and ARPA could be eligible. So we will bring those back accordingly. But just so if somebody was to actually look at the books, there's money going to start moving, and we wanted to make sure that everybody had that awareness. The last piece, and this is that we did this back in January. We did it last year in June. It's all of those other federal funds, whether it's like SNAP or we provided to State Finance Council like the full chart of all of the direct funds that are funding federal programs, most of which are the pre-existing. Per the statutes, that still has to, State Finance Council approved a resolution last June for those that came through CRF. We approved a resolution. These are for the blanket ones that go to the agencies, the things that they draw down. But this way we have a full record of what all of those dollars are. We passed one in January for the December bill, the CAA bill. And so we will be preparing that list for State Finance Council again in relationship to what has currently been identified in ARPA, understanding that that may change. The December bill didn't change at all, so when we submitted that original list, it never changed. This one, there may be some variation, but we'll track on it if something else comes out or emerges. But these are the federal funds that are flowing into pre-existing federal programs that are just coming through. And so that is part of written into statute that because they are designated in a relief bill, that they still have to go through for that approval. They can't be used for anything else. They can't be used by any other entity. They are tied to specific things. Some are in transportation, some are in health, education, KDADs. And so their chart lists what the fund is and the dollar amount and the agency in a mini description. And as I said, we did this in January for the December bill, and we did it last June for the original CARES Act. So again, awareness more so than anything, that is also happening in relationship to State Finance Council. With that, I am done for today. You can turn that off.
Thank you, Secretary Burns-Wallace, and I want to thank the members of the committee. It's been a long afternoon, but a very important afternoon. We've, I think, been able to establish a baseline and a couple things that are clear. We've got a group that asks good questions, important questions, and that's going to want data, and we need that data as early as possible so that we can digest that, and that's what we're going to work to achieve. And I think we've got an opportunity here, as we've talked about, once we figure out, as the speaker said, where do we want to end up, we can really do some significant things that are going to better this state now and for our grandchildren. So thank you all. I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Have a motion second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Thank you.